Please welcome to the stage Curtis Yarvin, founder of Urbit, Ramesh Srinivasan, author and professor at UCLA, and our moderator for this debate, Cenk Uygur from the Young Turks.
All right, welcome everybody. Great to see you here. We're going to do an interesting discussion / debate here. And Curtis, as you saw there and heard, was founder of Urbit, and he's the writer at Gray Mirror. Ramesh is professor at UCLA and does the Utopias podcast. So in the year 2026, we are going to debate the issue of monarchy. Fascinating. Sir Curtis, you have the theory of techno-monarchy. What is that?
Well, you know, we're debating forms of government here, and I always like to start with a great couplet by the English poet Alexander Pope, who said, "For forms of government, let fools contest, whatever governs best is best." I think government is a very important part, as an essential part of the human experience. I'm not a libertarian, and I want to see a government that governs best. And when I look at the governments that we have here in the West, I see that we have this strange, puzzling thing where we believe we have the best form of government in history, and yet, you know, examples of its failure are really manifest. So what is the purpose of government? What is the role of government? There's a great line from the ancients, which is salus populi suprema lex. The health of the people is the supreme law. And that means health in the broadest sense. So I believe that we should be governed so that, you know, all the people who are governed thrive. That's an interesting definition. It's hard to quantify. It's not really the same as GDP or anything, but when I walk around the streets of Vancouver, especially at night, I do not get the sense of universal thriving. And I get the sense of a system that would shock not only many people from different systems of government, such as China, but you know, people from our own past. And so when I look at this kind of failed system, what I see is that we worship this word democracy. Democracy seems to me to mean two things. People are fighting over this term that is essentially a term for legitimacy. Some people believe in populism, which is essentially democracy from the ground up. The idea is that the people should rule. Other people believe in progressivism, which is essentially government through a conversation of elites. I think that basically both of those forces are very critical of each other, and very rightly so. We're looking at essentially oligarchy versus, you know, populism, mass democracy. Neither of these things have worked very well. And then we look at, you know, history, and we see that 98% of governments in the past are monarchies. We look at, you know, everything that, every gadget that you have is designed by a monarchy, Apple, made in a monarchy, which is China. And you're just like, all right, we have these two systems. One is the essentially oligarchic progressivism, the rule of elites. The other is the rule of the vox populi. Neither of them seem to work. We have this system of monarchy, which is used not only at the governmental level, but in every corporation, every restaurant, every film, every large enterprise that all people do. Why not, if we're in a hole, stop digging and see how, if we can get the oldest form to work for us again?
All right. Ramesh, what's your response?
Yeah, I mean, I want to start with thanking you both for this conversation, and just reminding us all of what Gabor Mate said on this very stage yesterday, which is we need to look at what our possibilities are in the present moment. There's no question, Mr. Yarvin and I would agree, and I think Cenk would also agree, that our democracy in the United States, not here in Canada, is a mess at the moment. But that is, in my mind, exactly because of, if not autocracy, but autocratic-like power, right? We basically see an incredible strangling of the economy and our political lives being bought out, not by elite progressives. I don't really know what that exactly means, but I do understand that there's some people who, you know, like progressive ideas, have a lot of educational background and training and so on, like yourself and myself. But at the same time, I believe that what we are sitting through is basically authoritarian, somewhat monarchic-like and oligarchic power. And if we look at every major technology CEO, not everyone, but many of them, and we look at the administration in the United States itself, we can see autocracy in the making, authoritarianism in the making. Note the No Kings protest. The No Kings protest had record numbers of people around the world, but certainly in the United States, protesting, standing up, saying we do not want monarchic rule because monarchic rule means more concentration of power, more concentration of abuse, and so on. So autocratic and authoritarian power is the problem, and the very solutions that Mr. Yarvin is proposing, with all due respect, will actually accent and amplify the very problems we have. His solutions are the problem. His solutions in many ways are exactly what we are sitting through. So just look at every example from Musk to Bezos, to Palantir manifestos, to the Trump administration itself, and we can see the abuses tied with monarchic-like power. Now, whether it's a single monarch or many monarchs, that's another question, right? But at the same time, what I truly believe is the incredible inequalities we're sitting through, 3 times more inequalities in wealth than the Gilded Age period, is a result and an expression of authoritarian and monarchic power. Thank you.
So, Curtis, there's different words for monarch, right? There's king, there's dictator. So, how do we pick the dictator or monarch, or do we pick them, or do they just do it by force? Because I'm truly trying to understand what you're saying, right? Everybody, of course, wants to understand how this would work. And then if we or they have picked the wrong person, are we just screwed for life?
Well, you must know the Latin proverb "Quis custodiet ipsus custodius," right?
Obviously,
sure. And I would ask, how did we pick Fauci? How did Fauci get picked? Because Fauci had pretty much monarchical authority over American virology for about 40 years, and it was pretty impossible to get rid of him, and he was pretty much accountable to nobody. And when we look for basically unaccountable systems in, quote, our democracy, unquote, we see a lot of people whose, vertical power, makes, Henry VIII look like Gandhi. And so this problem of who watches the watchdogs is somehow a problem that we thought had been solved. Let me give you an example of someone who has, monarchical authority, who is basically widely respected probably in this audience. His name is A.G. Sulzberger. He's the CEO of the New York Times. He's a 5th-generation hereditary monarch, and he's the head of the most prestigious organization in the world. How was he picked? Do you know?
His dad gave it to him.
No, actually, it's more complicated than that. It's an amazing system. The New York Times has a dual-class share structure of Class A and Class B shares. Class A shares are held only by the descendants of Adolf Ox, or I forget his name, something Ox, who lived in the 19th century. So, the thing is, we try and kick monarchy out the door, and we find that it comes in through the window.
Yeah.
Okay. I've got to stay with you because, wait, but how do you have a system in place on how you pick the dictator?
So the question is, there are actually 2 separate questions there. One is, how do you get from here to an effective monarchy? And 2 is, how does that monarchy sustain and continue itself? And the thing is, if you're looking for a perfect or mechanical form of history, you won't find one. History is full of conflict, and only conflict creates, authority. How is, I would say perhaps the greatest monarch of the 20th century. I mean, there are a lot of great candidates. There's Deng Xiaoping, there's Lee Kuan Yew, but of course, probably nearest and dearest to your heart is Mustafa Kemal, Ataturk. How was Ataturk picked?
He won wars.
He won wars, right? And so, ultimately, history cannot be separated from conflict. And essentially how you come to how was Napoleon picked? He won wars. Others have won elections. Like, history is a world of conflict. The way in which you have a regime change is there's no regime above the regime that changes your regime into something else. History is contingent. And I think the more interesting question is, having gotten an effective monarch, how do you keep that? Because people die.
All right, so Ramesh, I want to give you more time to respond.
Sure.
So 1, respond to some of the monarchs are not that bad. 2, don't we have monarchs in the New York Times and in and in this, in the business world, and whatever else you wanted to address.
Yeah, absolutely. So, someone like Dr. Fauci or the gentleman from the New York Times, these are examples of kind of hereditary elitism, essentially. So as
well, Fauci's not hereditary.
Yeah, in the New York Times case, exactly. So it basically handed down, right? So what we are speaking about strengthening democracy, strengthening democratic institutions, strengthening working and middle class people and their power are exactly an alternative to these problems that Mr. Yarvin is remarking upon, right? So what we need is a vibrant, multiracial, pluralistic democracy that creates economic outcomes for workers, for consumers, and so on. So you know who else benefits from dual-class share structures, who I don't know if you admire him or not, is Mr. Mark Zuckerberg. He can never be voted out of Facebook, as you know, I'm sure. And this is because of this dual-class share structure. So we agree that these are problems, that these are forms of corruption. Maybe we don't agree. But I will say this, that Mr. Yarvin likes to praise technology CEOs. I just wonder how efficient Elon Musk made the United States when he ran Doge. I wonder how efficient Palantir is when Mr. Alex Karp calls for, in his manifesto, allusions to a kind of a caste-like structure of society. What we don't want is the handmaid's tale. What we want is resurrecting the soul of America. And the soul of America is recognizing that in my country, not here in Canada, but in my country, we have many possibilities to create together. And that's what we need to do. We need to create possibilities together. So the goal is to strengthen democracy. And it's very interesting when I look at your arguments in your work, sir, that you actually conflate elitism and progressivism. There's nothing less similar than those two. I understand there are some people who sympathize with progressive views, like Tom Steyer or whatever, who are elites, but most do not. In fact, it's elites and billionaires and oligarchs that are destroying democracy as we speak, and many of them are directly tied to the technology industry.
So, Curtis, before you answer, I want to add a couple of questions there. So, I get to either buy an iPhone or not. I get to read the New York Times or not. But I don't get to leave this country. This is my country. So if I hand it off to a monarch, I don't have a choice.
You don't have a choice, in the administration you have. You don't have a choice of Dr. Fauci. You don't have a choice of, let me give you a couple of anecdotes. So my father was a member of the deep state. He served the state very faithfully. When, he was nominally a member of the executive branch, but in fact he was, like Dr. Fauci, not democratically accountable in any way, shape, or form. His father, Norman Yarvin, he always used the word progressive with me. In fact, he was a communist. And if you look at the history of the word progressive as used in the US, actually you have a very clear lineage going well back to the 1930s. And progressivism in America has always been sort of a sandwich of the high and the low. It's been a leadership class combined with a class of followers, or you might say clients. And absolutely, if you go see, if you're interested in the history of progressivism in America, go see the film Reds from the 1980s. All of those people would have called themselves progressive. Sure. And, they went back to the Harvard class of 1912. The elite tradition of progressivism is a very old and a very factual thing in America. And I have a question for you. Sure. Professor Srinivasan, which is that you've expressed a lot of interesting abstractions about coming together. How do we come together and build a high-speed train? How do we come together and build things that actually work?
Okay.
No, go ahead.
Okay, sure. So first of all, this term progressive, let's not fixate on it. It doesn't matter how the term is used historically and how we understand it today. When I'm speaking about progressivism, I'm speaking about people like Bernie Sanders and others. $18 people paid an average donation for that campaign. That's completely different than some of the authoritarians and oligarchs that in many ways Mr. Yarvin praises, who actually benefit from the destruction of our democracy, the passage of Citizens United, and the buying out, essentially, of our democracy. So how do we strengthen things? This is a great question. Many aspects. You're an internet pioneer. I respect your work with Urbit. Many internet technologies were not created by monarchs. They were created by people like you. right? They're created by immigrants in many cases. Many of the web itself, as you know, the internet itself started at my university by Len Kleinrock, thanks to public funding, right? So the point I'm trying to make is that what we can do is strengthen small businesses, medium-sized businesses, other modes of actually creating jobs, which actually these are entities that create far more jobs than big corporations, because what we don't want to do, basically many of your arguments are critiquing this kind of, fiefdom of handouts, and I agree with you with that. But what we need to do is actually strengthen the kinds of institutions and businesses and so on that actually can create value for our country, and that's what we need to do.
So Curtis,
Please.
Can I respond?
Yes.
Of course.
Yeah. So let me break your brain a little bit. I think the most successful engineering project of all time, there's probably two examples. There's the Manhattan Project and the Apollo Project. Obviously, the Apollo Project, also created by immigrants, also a government project. Let's focus on the Manhattan Project for a moment, because it was absolutely a government project. It was publicly funded. It was created under the last great American dictator, FDR, who had essentially personal autocratic rule. And it was run like a startup, right down to the technical co-founder and the non-technical co-founder, Oppenheimer and Groves. And probably at least half of the people working on the project, if we've seen that film, were communists. Or as they often would have said, even at that time, progressives. And so, where does that fit in a way? Would you accept building a high-speed train that was run in the same way that the Manhattan Project was run? Because the Manhattan Project was absolutely run like a startup.
Well, let's look at how high-speed trains actually are built in places that actually are democracies. We've seen many examples of high-speed rail in countries, in European countries, and in other parts of the world. I understand they're effective in an authoritarian country in China, but the high-speed train is not simply a product of authoritarian power, right? The technology is going to be created from many different contexts and many different outcomes, right? So the Manhattan Project, we can even debate the merits of that project or even the ethics of that project, but you can't simply say that's a project that emerges simply because of FDR, right?
okay, so Curtis, how do we know the monarch's not going to shoot us in the head?
So there's two, basically, how do we know that Dr. Fauci isn't going to invent a pandemic that kills 20 million people? We don't. And he did. And this is essentially the question of accountability, which is, essentially there's two things that we want from a state. We want efficiency and effectiveness, and we especially want that efficiency and effectiveness to align with our mission of Salus Populi Suprema Lex, basically creating a government that enables everyone to thrive. And then we want to make sure that the system does not go awry. Well, the way that's done in the private sector is this wonderful, wonderful institution called the board of directors. So we separate administration and accountability, and we want our directors to be independent so that they're not directly involved in management, so that they're basically sitting over there. Take the case of a company with an active board, which is Apple. Right. So Apple had, the board saved Apple in the 90s because they brought Steve Jobs back. And then they replaced him with Tim Apple, and now they have there's some other guy, I forget his name, and they do almost nothing. And actually, the succession from Steve to Tim was entirely peaceful, and so with no conflict at all. But Apple would have gone in the toilet basically had they not brought Steve back. Yep. And so having this separate accountability structure that basically is the structure that says, okay, the CEO dies, he gets a brain tumor, he goes crazy, it happens. He suffers from dementia, like our wonderful Joe Biden, and who was a really fun guy before he had all those problems. And somebody needs to hold, no one was able to hold, the Biden family accountable until they wheeled him out on stage and showed the whole American people that he had dementia, which was an astounding thing. And so, the search for accountability is a very, very hard problem. At the same time, when I have these conversations, they often don't appear to be taking place in reality. They're taking place in a place with just absolutely awful government. I mean, yes, Canada, walk around Vancouver at night, I beg you, I ask you, walk down like Homer Street at night, you will not see good governance, you will see hieronymus bosh. You will see the same things in San Francisco. So really the perfect is the enemy of the good. I think it's possible to design a good system of sovereign accountability, and I know it is not possible to define a perfect system. We should not be searching for utopias.
Okay, unless it's his podcast. So
We could have a live debate.
That's totally accidental.
okay, so I'm going to come back to the idea of board of directors, but Ramesh, I want you to address two of the things that he said.
Sure.
Look, there are people inside the government like Fauci, he says is unaccountable anyway, okay? And secondly, isn't it true that a sole leader, whether it's in a company or in a country like China, is going to be more efficient almost by definition?
Yeah, a leader is not the same as a monarch. A leader is not the same as an authoritarian. Leadership can exist in many different ways, right? Leadership can be about inspiring others, and you're certainly right. I actually grew up in the same neighborhood as Steve Jobs and went to the same high school, Homestead High School, as Steve Jobs, and he is obviously an incredibly remarkable and creative person, and his personal leadership and vision was extremely important. But that does not say it's baby with bathwater, sir. It's not necessary. A great leader doesn't mean it has to be an authoritarian or a monarch. Similarly, democracy is not the same as folks like Fauci or the Bidens, who are obviously part of a corrupt political system that has been bought out by the very corporations that you are admiring, sir. So that's the question I have for you. The reason why, corporate power, especially tech corporate power, has been dominating DC. I think you would agree with this. No, you wouldn't. Okay, since Obama administration, sir. So basically, my point being that the corporate unaccountability, which is mainly boards of directors and investors, are exactly what are driving us off the rails in our country and blocking people from, like Senator Sanders, who remains the most popular politician in the United States, from actually ascending to power. So we agree that the Bidens and so on are issues. But I think what you're mistaking, sir, is actually the very problems that exist are symptoms of increased oligarchic and somewhat authoritarian power. Would you agree with me that President Trump is the most authoritarian president we've had since FDR?
I don't really. Well, no. I would go with LBJ certainly. I don't.
Okay, sure.
The word authoritarian doesn't really actually mean a lot to me.
He has a lot of power.
No, he has actually very little power.
Oh, come on.
Here's a way.
Bending the knee.
Here's a way to measure.
Sorry.
Here's a way to measure how much power any institution or any system has. You have to measure it on an absolute scale next to absolute power, and it's a simple test. If you can increase the power of anything, for anything on a scale of 0 to 1, if you can increase it by 10x, it's got to be less than 0.1. If you can increase it by 100x, it's got to be less than 0.01. And when I basically think, could I increase, when I compare the power of Trump to the power of FDR or the power of Ataturk, I see at least 2 orders of magnitude. So I think, no, actually, he's very, very weak in his authority over the executive branch. One of the odd things about the presidency that we have today, the executive branch is not run by the president. It's run by Congress. And the way that Congress works is it essentially integrates this vast bribery machine, which is completely, independent of any kind of political power. Like the House has an incumbency rate of 98%. The Senate is about 90%. There's a seniority system that makes up the difference. And you have this vast horse trading system of lobbyists and activists that produce these incredible bills. The president, is an afterthought next to Congress. Nobody ever comes to the White House to testify before the president. They testify before Congress. Now, where the president does have almost plenary, unlimited authority is over foreign policy. And that's a strange thing because that's actually the reverse of what the Constitution describes. And so I think one of the places where the Trump administration has sort of gone to grief a little bit is that it's gone in the direction of the things that Trump can control and not the things that he can't control, which is domestic policy. But when people think about elections, they really think that they're electing a king. They use language that suggests that Trump is sort of the CEO of the country somehow, and it's completely a fiction. So no, I think that Trump has very little power over the executive branch. I think the executive branch would actually run fine entirely without a president. I think that life in DC changed very little between Obama and Trump, and in most jobs, in most agencies, you would not even notice the difference.
Okay, I want to squeeze in a couple more questions. But Ramesh, address this point about the high-speed rail in China or the fact that they build incredible cities seemingly overnight in China. Is centralized planning not more efficient?
No, it's absolutely fine to have experts and leaders in certain areas who have power in implementing particular projects. But that's very different than a vision that accentuates and amplifies the very problems we're struggling with in the United States. So let's look at the Chinese case. The Chinese implementation of anti-poverty measures, anti-illiteracy measures are remarkable. Now the question is I would say probably you would say that that's only because of authoritarian power. Would you agree with that?
Well, all governments have absolute authority.
Yeah, they have power.
All
right?
governments have absolute power. If you basically find a government with that absolute power, you just haven't drawn the circle correctly around the government.
But yeah, thank you. But my point being that what you can't do is say because this amazing technology, in this case high-speed rail, happened to exist in China, that means that monarchic authoritarian power is the way to go, because high-speed rail can exist and come out of other conditions as well. My very point is that we're confusing many things right now, that we are living in the United States within a corrupt political system that is bought out by big corporations. That's been an ongoing issue for a very long time, not just because of Citizens United. That is why the politicians that Mr. Yarvin is critiquing are actually part of this corporate, technocracy issue, right? So what I'm trying to say is that I can give you umpteen numbers of examples of remarkable technologies, if that's what we care about. What I care about is the quality of life, people living lives of dignity, people living lives that are of healthcare and work and education. But if we just want to talk about technology and fetishize that, though it should never be about technology, we can see many examples of incredible technologies of all kinds, before the digital as well, that were created by auteurs, inventors, schools, Tim Berners-Lee, of course, with CERN, with the web and so on. So there are many examples of our creativity. But if we are being potentially persecuted, maybe not if they're your benevolent monarch, but how the hell do we make sure that that happens? If we are going to be persecuted by a monarch, how could our creativity even be expressed or released? How could we actually be entrepreneurial on any level at all? How can we be creative at all? I think what we need to do is decide how to live a life of dignity. And in the United States, you're correct that our soul has been compromised because of corporate technocracy.
I think arguably the most, just to respond to one of your points, I think arguably the most creative era in Anglo-American history was the Elizabethan age of Shakespeare, which of course had a more or less absolute monarch in Elizabeth I. Can you clarify? Do you have a problem with Elizabeth I?
I think the thing you do, sir, in your arguments is you point out positive or events or examples that you praise, and then you sort of connect them to governance in that period, but it's not clear how the governance of that period generates these outcomes, right? So what I would also like to point out is that in more pluralistic democracies, which we certainly are not living in the United States, so we can agree with that as well. In more true democracies, there's also many powerful outcomes that can occur. And I will just cite one thing, I'm curious if you know his work. I was a student of Amartya Sen, an economist at Harvard. I took multiple courses from him, and he basically showed empirically, won the Nobel Prize for this work, not some woke person, old school Bengali intellectual. He basically showed that in pluralistic democracies, when people have choice, when people create choice, they can actually create economic outcomes that are better for all included. Why is that? Because it addresses Curtis Yarvin's concerns, Cenk Uygur's concerns, and Ramesh Srinivasan's concerns. Those are more resilient political and economic systems, and we really need to build those in our country right now.
Okay. Curtis, before the debate ends, I've got to ask you the exit plan, right? So with Ataturk, I understand what you're saying. He wins wars, he does autocracy for a while, but his exit plan was democracy. And so he set up a democracy, and then it functioned relatively since then. So is there an exit plan here? Who's the board of directors? If the monarch does start shooting all of us in the head, what do we do?
So there's a lot of different approaches to that problem that have been taken over history. Personally, there are two basic solutions. One is the tried and true hereditary model, and the hereditary model gets a huge boost by modern technology, because a serious problem with a hereditary model is how do you make sure that you have a good, king in the next, or queen in the next generation. This was a serious problem when it was left to 17th century fertility technology. We have 21st century fertility technology. It's easy to, raise up a whole stable of, 300 potential heirs, test them all psychometrically. Of course, you had the Ottoman system where you had many large numbers of heirs coming out of the harem, and the question was who prevailed in the struggle, and the rest were strangled with the silken bowstring. I think that worked quite well for many more centuries than this country has been around. I think it was actually quite successful. It, of course, had its downsides. And then we come to, full-on science fiction stuff. I'm a full-on science fiction kind of guy. I'm a California kind of guy, and I think we can take the board of directors system and tweak it a little bit to make it work at the sovereign level so that the king can't arrest the directors. And I have a very clever system of anonymous directors on the blockchain, which unfortunately we're out of time.
We are out of time. I got to give you last word, though. Ottoman Empire didn't exactly end well, but what's the downside of having a hereditary system or the other system that he's referring to?
It's just, I want a more abundant vision of our country and our life. I don't think we need to be fatalistic and give up on our country, on our democracy, just because it's gone off the rails because of corporate technocracy and because of corporate takeover of our government. I, like you, nice thing to end on, love science fiction as well, but I don't want a world of RoboCop and Terminator and The Matrix. I'm much more interested in Star Trek. So these are different visions of the future, of life, that are right in front of us. The United States is not done for. We can recover our country, and remember, again, people who speak truth to power and are true and honest still remain the most democratically popular. So democratic popularity is what actually creates positive outcomes, but I agree that our system is corrupted, and that's why we need to resurrect it on every level possible, starting by getting lobbyists and corporate money out of politics.
All right. So today we end in the year 2026 on, don't worry, AI is going to create a holodeck. And here we are debating dictatorship. Okay, so good luck to all of us. Thank you.
What a world. Thank you all.
Thank you.